A single photograph can be a bridge to a past you thought was buried forever. Margaretchen had learned long ago that the world moved in two speeds: the speed of those who had enough, and the speed of those who didn't. She existed in the latter category, moving through life in a perpetual sprint that never quite got her anywhere. The fluorescent lights of Rosewood Diner hummed their mechanical song at 4:47 a.m. Margaret had already been awake for an hour, not because she wanted to be, but because sleep felt like a luxury her body could no longer afford. The 5 a.m. darkness pressed against the diner's windows like something solid, something that needed to be pushed back with coffee and determination. She moved through the empty dining room, her worn apron tied tight around her waist, the fabric thin enough that you could see the outline of her small frame beneath it. There was a coffee stain near the pocket from Tuesday or maybe Wednesday. She couldn't remember. It didn't matter. No one was coming for 2 hours. No one would notice. But Margaret noticed everything. She noticed a burnt toast smell that never quite left the kitchen, mingling with artificial vanilla syrup so sickeningly sweet it coated the back of her throat. She noticed the way the fluorescent lights made her hands look skeletal as she wiped down tables that were already clean. She noticed the tremor in her fingers, exhaustion or anxiety. She could no longer distinguish between them. Her daughter Sarah lay in Portland General Hospital 3 blocks away, in a room that cost more per night than Margaret made in a week. Leukemia, stage 3. The word had been thrown at her by doctors with kind voices and apologetic expressions, as if sympathy could somehow ease the weight of medical bills that multiplied faster than she could earn money to pay them. $200,000, then $250,000, now approaching $300,000. And Sarah was only halfway through treatment. 2 jobs wasn't enough. 3 jobs wouldn't be enough. Margaret had stopped calculating the math months ago because the numbers only ever moved in one direction. Up. The debt, the bills, the impossible. This wasn't a redemption story where hard work fixed everything and the poor girl got rescued by circumstances. This was a story of how a forgotten photograph would expose 3 generations of lies and cost a powerful man everything he thought he'd built. Margaret pulled down the cardboard box from the storage closet above the walk-in freezer. The lost and found. Years of accumulated items. Sunglasses, scarves, a leather wallet, a child's toy truck. Her manager had finally asked her to organize it, to see if anything was worth keeping. She moved through the box mechanically, her mind already calculating how many more hours of overtime she'd need to request. That's when her fingers found it. The locket was smaller than a thumbnail, tarnished silver with a pattern of 5 roses etched into its surface in meticulous detail. Real silver, professional craftsmanship, the kind of piece that had cost real money once decades ago. She turned it over in her palm, feeling its weight. Heavier than expected, substantial in a way that suggested significance. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, engraved in flowing script, Eleanor and Thomas, 1952. Eleanor, her grandmother's name. The locket felt warm in her palm despite the cold diner, as if it had been waiting for her specifically, as if some invisible thread connecting past to present had suddenly pulled taut. Margaret's breath caught. She held a piece of her own history, something she'd never known existed, something that had been lost in a diner's backroom for who knew how long. She had no way of knowing yet that this small, tarnished piece of silver would unravel everything. But on that 5 a.m. morning, as the first hints of gray light crept into Portland's darkness, Margaretchen held her grandmother's locket and felt the first crack in the wall of her ordinary, impossible life. If you're watching this story unfold, if you feel the weight of impossible circumstances like Margaret does, you need to subscribe now. Because what comes next changes everything, and you won't want to miss it. The photograph lived in a shoebox beneath Margaret's bed, tucked behind a suitcase she hadn't opened in years. She'd looked at it maybe a dozen times in her life, always quickly, as if prolonged viewing might somehow diminish what little she had of her grandmother. In the photo, a young woman stood beside a man in what appeared to be Vienna, based on the ornate architecture visible behind them. The woman wore a dark dress, her hand resting on the man's arm, her smile genuine but reserved. Around her neck hung a locket, not similar to the one Margaret held now. Identical. The same 5 roses in the same precise arrangement. The same tarnished marks in the same places. Margaret turned the locket over in her trembling hands, comparing it mentally to the image burned into her memory. Her breath came shallow. This wasn't coincidence. This was impossible, made physical. She'd asked her mother Patricia about the photograph once years ago. "That's Eleanor," Patricia had said, her voice carrying a strange mix of love and something darker. Resignation, maybe, or carefully maintained distance. "Your grandmother." Margaret had pressed for more, but Patricia had closed that door the way she closed many doors. With finality. "Some pasts are better left in the past, sweetheart. Eleanor died before you were born. That's all you need to know." But now Margaret held proof that there was infinitely more to know. Her hands shook as she placed the locket on her kitchen table. The silver caught the afternoon light, and she could see the engravings clearly now. Eleanor and Thomas, 1952. Her grandmother, a man named Thomas. A year, a moment captured in metal and time, waiting 70 years to be found. Margaret's mind spiraled. Where had the locket been all these years? How had it ended up in a diner's lost and found? And more importantly, why did another person have an identical one? People didn't just have duplicate lockets made. These were pieces designed to be unique, to be singular tokens of love or commitment, unless they were meant to match, unless they belonged to two people bound together by something that required matching silver and engraved names. She called in sick to her evening job. The first time in 3 years, she'd done so. The guilt was immediate and sharp, but something more urgent drove her now. She needed answers. She needed to understand what her grandmother had left behind, what secrets were embedded in 70-year-old silver. That night, Margaret returned to Rosewood Diner for her closing shift. She arrived at 9:47 p.m., when the dinner crowd had thinned to stragglers. She was wiping down the counter, her mind still turning over the locket, when the bell above the door chimed. The man who entered carried himself like someone accustomed to rooms adjusting themselves to his presence. He was silver-haired, perhaps 70, dressed in an Armani suit that probably cost more than Margaret made in a month. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the tile floor. An expensive watch caught the light as he raised his hand to check the time, a gesture that suggested time mattered to him, that he measured his life in increments valuable enough to require precision. And around his neck, visible against his crisp white shirt, hung a gold chain. And on that chain hung a locket. The diner seemed to hold its breath. Margaret's co-worker, Devin, immediately straightened his posture. The busboy moved with more care. Even the ambient noise seemed to lower, conversations becoming whispers, the kitchen sounds becoming more distant. This was what wealth did. It entered a room and immediately reorganized the social hierarchy, reminding everyone of their place. The man sat in a booth near the window. Margaret found herself moving toward him before she'd made a conscious decision to do so. Her hands felt cold despite the warm kitchen. Her voice, when it came, was steadier than she expected. "Excuse me, sir. My grandmother had a locket exactly like that one." The words hung in the air. The man's coffee cup, halfway to his lips, froze. His jaw clenched visibly. Color drained from his face as if someone had pulled a plug and let all his blood drain downward. He set the cup down with deliberate care, the ceramic making a soft sound against the saucer. When he looked at her, his eyes held something Margaret couldn't quite name. Fear, maybe. Recognition? Definitely. "That's impossible," he said. The words came out measured, controlled. But underneath was something dangerous. The tone of a man delivering verdict, not opinion. Margaret's courage flickered, but held. "I have a photograph. My grandmother wore one just like it. Not similar. The exact same locket." The man stood abruptly, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to step backward. His gaze traveled across her features, her eyes, her cheekbones, the shape of her mouth, as if he were reading something written in her DNA. "Who was your grandmother?" His voice had changed, become almost urgent. Eleanor Chin. She." "That's impossible," he repeated. But this time the word cracked slightly at the edges. Margaret held her ground. "I have proof. The photograph." The man reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather wallet. He placed several bills on the table, far more than a coffee and water cost. The gesture wasn't payment. It was dismissal. It was the kind of excess that only the wealthy could afford. throwing money at a situation as if monetary value could somehow erase inconvenient truths. He stood, straightening his jacket with sharp movements that radiated controlled fury. He began walking toward the door, his posture declaring this conversation over. "Then prove it," Margaret called out, surprising herself. "If you're so certain your story is the real one, prove it." Gregory Ashford stopped at the door. He turned slowly, and in that moment, Margaret saw something flicker across his face, something beneath the arrogance and authority, something that looked almost like fear. "You have no idea what you're asking for, Miss Chan." Margaret Chin. His expression hardened into something colder, more dangerous. "This conversation is over." But as he turned to leave, Margaret caught it. The uncertainty in his eyes, the moment of recognition that had passed between them. This man knew something. This man had his own version of Eleanor's story, and whatever it was, it had shaken him to his core. He left into the Portland night, and Margaret was left standing alone in the diner, the weight of a 70-year-old secret suddenly pressing down on her shoulders. Something had shifted, something had awakened, and whatever came next would demand that Margaret should choose between the safety of not knowing and the dangerous liberation of truth. She didn't know yet that this choice would require courage she wasn't sure she possessed, but she was about to find out. Gregory Ashford returned to Rosewood Diner 3 days later. Margaret was beginning her shift when he walked through the door, and this time she recognized him immediately. He moved with the same authoritative stride, but something had changed. His eyes looked tired. His jaw carried a tension that suggested sleepless nights. He sat in the same booth, ordered coffee, and waited. Margaret knew he was waiting for her. She approached with her notepad, her hands steadier than her heart. Gregory's gaze fixed on her face, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had spent 72 hours reaching conclusions he'd hoped never to reach. "That locket is one of kind," he began, not bothering with pleasantries. "Commissioned in Vienna in 1952 by a master craftsman named Heinrich Rice. Only 2 were ever made." Margaret's pen hovered over her notepad. Two, Gregory confirmed. His coffee arrived, and he ignored it. One belonged to Eleanor Hoffman, the other to Thomas Ashford, my older brother. The diner seemed to tilt slightly. Margaret set down her pen. "It belonged to my late wife, Eleanor Ashford. She died in 1989, Gregory continued, his voice becoming more clipped, more controlled. "She kept that locket with her every day of our marriage. Never removed it. Never explained why it mattered so much. She died taking its secrets with her." He leaned forward. "Now you're telling me your grandmother had one, and Eleanor, which means either your grandmother was a thief who stole from my family, or your family has been lying to you for 3 generations. The accusation landed like a physical blow. Margaret's face flushed. "My grandmother was not a thief." "Then what?" Gregory's voice dropped, became almost gentle, which somehow made it more terrifying. "Your family stole from mine? Or they stole her from my family?" Margaret's hands clenched at her sides. Before she could respond, Gregory threw bills on the table again, this time with more force, as if the gesture itself carried his frustration. He stood, his body language broadcasting dismissal, the kind of finality that came from someone accustomed to having the last word. "Enjoy your shift," he said, turning toward the door. The other customers had gone quiet. Devin was staring. The busboy had paused mid-task. Everyone could sense the tension, the class imbalance, the invisible curtain of privilege hanging between them. "Then prove it," Margaret said, her voice cutting through the silence. "If you're so certain your story is the real one, prove it." Gregory stopped at the threshold. The door was half open, and the Portland evening air drifted in, carrying the smell of rain and possibility. He turned slowly, and Margaret saw something shift behind his eyes, some internal calculation being made. "You have no idea what you're asking for, Miss Chan." Margaret Chin. His expression hardened. The arrogance returned, layering itself over whatever vulnerability had briefly surfaced. "This conversation is over." But he didn't leave immediately. He stood there for a moment, his expensive shoes on the threshold between 2 worlds. The world where he belonged, where money and family history secured his position, and the world Margaret inhabited, where survival was measured in shifts and tips. When he finally walked out into the night, Margaret understood something fundamental. The man was uncertain. Whatever authority he projected, whatever privilege he wielded, something in her claim had destabilized him. Over the next week, Margaret became hyper-aware of details she'd previously overlooked. She began researching Eleanor Hoffman during her breaks, using her phone's limited internet access at the library. She found nothing. No birth records, no news articles, no digital footprint beyond her mother's vague memories. But she kept the locket with her constantly now, wearing it beneath her uniform. It became a talisman of possibility, a physical reminder that there were answers waiting to be found. Then, unexpectedly, Gregory returned. It was a Tuesday evening, and he arrived just as Margaret was setting up the final tables. He looked worse than before, his suit still immaculate, but somehow hanging on him differently, as if he'd lost weight in the intervening days. He ordered coffee and waited for Margaret to approach. "I hired investigators," he said, without preamble. "I wanted to prove you were lying." Margaret's stomach tightened. "I wanted to discover that your grandmother was a con artist, that she'd stolen from my family, that you were trying to extort money." His voice was hollow, tired. "I wanted a simple answer." "And," Margaret whispered. "And I found something much more complicated," Gregory said. He pulled out his phone and showed her a document, scanned immigration records. Eleanor Hoffman arrived in Portland in 1953, pregnant, alone. The words hit Margaret like cold water. Her grandmother had been pregnant when she arrived. Alone. Gregory's expression shifted, becoming almost vulnerable. "My brother Thomas was engaged to someone else. A woman from a prominent Portland family. A business arrangement, really. And then he met Eleanor, and suddenly everything changed. He broke the engagement. He married Eleanor instead, though the family never fully accepted it." He set the phone down. "The point is, I don't know what your grandmother's story is. I don't know who got hurt or how, but I know it's connected to mine, and I know the locket is somehow the key." He stood to leave, but this time he moved differently, not with dismissal, but with something closer to resignation. "If you want to find the truth, Miss Chin, you're going to need help. And whether I like it or not, I'm the only person who can provide it." Margaret watched him leave, understanding in that moment that the rules of their interaction had fundamentally shifted. They were no longer adversaries. They were, whether they wanted to be or not, partners in uncovering a secret that someone with power and resources had spent 70 years keeping buried. And that realization terrified her more than anything else had. Margaret's mother had raised her alone in a small apartment on the east side of Portland, working as a nurse's aide and carrying with her the quiet weight of unanswered questions. Patricia Chin had inherited two things from her mother Eleanor: a single photograph and a collection of scattered stories that never quite added up into coherence. Eleanor had arrived in America in 1953, pregnant and alone, carrying nothing but a single suitcase and the locket that would eventually find its way to Margaret's trembling hands. She'd worked as a seamstress, Patricia had said once. She'd been skilled with her hands, patient with detail work. She'd never spoken about the pregnancy's father, never explained, never even acknowledged the question, though it hung in the air between them like something living. Eleanor had died when Margaret was 2 years old, a sudden stroke that had stolen her away before Margaret could form memories that would stick. Patricia had grown up wondering. Margaret understood this now, understood it in the way you understand someone's pain only when it becomes your own. Who was the father? Why the secrecy? What was she running from? These questions had haunted Patricia her entire life, creating a particular kind of wound, not from abandonment exactly, but from incompleteness, from a mother who loved her but couldn't explain herself, from a family history that began with a question mark. Now Margaret understood that wound intimately. Sarah lay in her hospital bed at Portland General, her small body fighting a war it shouldn't have to fight. Leukemia. The word had become Margaret's constant companion, a shadow that followed her through every shift, every sleepless night, every moment of calculating how many more hours she needed to work to push back against the tide of medical bills. The diagnosis had arrived 3 months ago, delivered by Dr. Reeves with professional sympathy and the kind of gentle cruelty that comes from delivering impossible truths. Stage 3. Treatment was aggressive. Prognosis was uncertain. Costs would be substantial. Substantial. Margaret had learned to hate that word. It was a euphemism for catastrophic, for life-altering, for the kind of debt that didn't care whether you're drowning or not. It would pull you under anyway. The bills had begun arriving immediately. $200,000. Then $250,000. Now they were approaching $300,000. And Sarah was only halfway through treatment. Chemotherapy, radiation, hospital stays, specialist consultations. Margaret worked her breakfast shift at Rosewood Diner from 5 a.m. to 2 p.m. Then her evening job cleaning office buildings from 6 p.m. to 11 p.m. She'd cut her sleep to 5 hours a night. She'd stopped buying anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. It wasn't enough. A social worker named James had sat down with her in the hospital cafeteria, his expression carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who delivered bad news about bureaucratic systems daily. "You may qualify for state assistance," he'd said, his voice gentle but realistic. "But the process takes months. There's paperwork, documentation, qualification periods. And even then it covers a percentage, not the full amount. Months." Margaret didn't have months. Sarah needed treatment now. But then Gregory Ashford had appeared with his expensive suit and his matching locket and his connection to Eleanor. And suddenly something had shifted in Margaret's understanding of what was possible. If Gregory truly knew Eleanor, if the locket meant what it seemed to mean, then maybe he knew something about Sarah's family history, family health history. The medical applications that came with Sarah's diagnosis had included a section for family medical background. That section was essentially blank. Unknown father, unknown paternal grandparents, unknown medical history on that entire side of the family tree. What if Eleanor's family carried genetic markers that mattered? What if there were cousins somewhere carrying research into leukemia treatment? What if the past held medical secrets that could affect Sarah's present survival? The investigation transformed in that moment from curiosity to urgency, from a mystery about a locket to a matter of her daughter's life. Margaret found herself in her childhood bedroom at her mother's house, sorting through boxes that Patricia had kept for decades. She located the photograph, the one of Eleanor smiling beside a man in Vienna. She studied it with new intensity, as if looking harder could somehow extract answers from the image itself. She remembered the conversation with her mother. Margaret must have been 6 or 7. Patricia had been showing her the photograph, her voice carrying that familiar mixture of love and distance. "This is Eleanor," Patricia had said. "Your grandmother. She never talked about your grandfather." Young Margaret had asked, "Why not?" Patricia's response had emerged slowly, as if she were measuring each word. "Some doors are best left closed, sweetheart. Some truths hurt more than mysteries." But now Margaret was older. Now she had a daughter fighting for her life. Now she understood that mysteries could be dangerous too. Dangerous in their incompleteness. Dangerous in what they obscured. Dangerous in the medical histories they left blank on hospital forms. The family wound had reopened, but this time with urgency. Patricia had spent her life wondering. Now Margaret needed to know. It wasn't an intellectual curiosity anymore. It was survival. The stakes had shifted entirely. This wasn't about proving that the Chun family hadn't stolen from the Ashfords. This wasn't about family honor or establishing whose grandmother had legitimacy. This was about whether Gregory Ashford might hold answers that could save her daughter's life. This was about whether the past contained secrets that affected the present in ways neither of them had anticipated. This was about whether Margaret's family was entitled to answers that could change everything, and whether Gregory would be willing to provide them. Margaret began with what she had, the photograph. She'd taken it to a professional photography studio and asked them to digitize it, to enhance the image, to make every detail as clear as possible. The photographer, a woman named Lisa with kind eyes and patient hands, worked on it without charge once Margaret explained about Sarah. She placed her grandmother's locket on the scanner next to Gregory's, photographing them both from multiple angles. The images confirmed what her hands had already known. They were identical. Same 5 roses in the same precise arrangement. Same tarnish patterns. Same weight, distribution, visible even in the photographs. Then she visited Rothschild and Sons, a jewelry store in downtown Portland that specialized in antique pieces. The jeweler, an elderly man named David, examined both lockets with a magnifying glass, turning them over in his weathered hands. "Handcrafted," he said finally, his voice carrying the authority of expertise. "Both of them. Same artisan. Same era. Probably 1952 or 1953, based on the craftsmanship style and the silver composition." He set them side by side on his examination table. "These were made as a pair," he continued. "Matching pieces. Someone commissioned them specifically to be identical. That wasn't cheap work. That was intentional, expensive craftsmanship." David provided her with documentation of his findings. Measurements precise to millimeters, material analysis confirming authentic silver, detailed notes about the craftsman marks visible on the interior surfaces. Each locket bore the initials of the same artisan. HRS. Margaret photographed everything, wrote everything down. She was building a case, though she wasn't entirely certain what she was trying to prove. The public records search began in the Portland City Archives. She found Eleanor's immigration documents, official paperwork confirming arrival March 1953 from Vienna, Austria. Listed occupation, seamstress. Listed destination, Portland, Oregon. Listed sponsor, unknown. That field was blank, which sent a chill through Margaret. Eleanor had arrived alone, pregnant, with no one waiting for her on this side of the Atlantic. Newspaper archives from 1952 and 1953 yielded nothing. No birth announcements for Eleanor. No society pages mentioning her. She was effectively invisible in the documented history of Portland, as if she'd materialized already pregnant and adult, ready only to work and survive. Social Security records showed Eleanor beginning employment in 1953. Her employer listed as private household for the first several years. No specifics, no details about who employed her or why. Margaret felt the investigation shifting from academic curiosity to something darker. A sense that Eleanor's invisibility had been deliberate, that someone powerful had worked to keep her off the public record. She contacted a genealogist named Robertson, no relation, despite the shared surname, through a local ancestry research service. When she explained about Sarah, about the medical history gap, about the locket, and the mystery, Robert agreed to investigate pro bono. "I have grandchildren," he said simply. "I understand what you're fighting for." Within 2 weeks, Robert had contacted her with preliminary findings. Eleanor Hoffman had been born in Vienna in 1925. Her birth certificate listed her father as unknown, a common notation in Austria for children born outside marriage. She'd grown up in Vienna, worked as a seamstress from age 16 onward. Then, abruptly, her documentation stopped in 1952. She disappears from Austrian records, Robert explained over the phone. No marriage record. No employment documentation. Nothing until the immigration paperwork showing her arrival in America. Margaret pressed. Was she engaged to anyone? Did she have a serious relationship? That's documented. Not officially, Robert said. But that doesn't mean much. People in that era didn't always document their personal relationships, especially if there were complications. The word complications hung between them. Over the following week, Margaret began noticing Gregory's car parked across the street from Rosewood Diner. A dark Mercedes, expensive and conspicuous. She'd see him through the window sometimes, watching the diner entrance, not entering. Once he looked directly at her through the glass, and she saw in that moment that he was investigating too, separately, desperately. Understanding bloomed in her chest. Gregory wasn't just powerful and arrogant. He was afraid. He was searching for answers just as frantically as she was, which meant the locket and Eleanor's story held significance that reached far beyond what either of them initially understood. Fear was the opposite of certainty. Fear meant secrets. Robert's next call came on a Thursday evening. His voice carried the particular excitement of someone who discovered something significant. The Vienna archives came through, he said. Eleanor Hoffman worked for the Ashford family, the Vienna branch. She was employed as a seamstress from 1950 to February 1953. Margaret's breath caught. Thomas Ashford employed her? Thomas Ashford specifically, Robert confirmed. Family records show he hired her personally. Now here's where it gets interesting. Her employment was terminated abruptly in February 1953. No notation for why, just terminated. And then And then Thomas Ashford married someone named Eleanor V. In April 1953 in Vienna. The marriage certificate confirms it. Eleanor V. Eleanor Hoffman presumably, though some records list her maiden name, some don't. Margaret forced herself to breathe. What about children? Did Thomas and Eleanor have children? The silence on the other end of the line stretched. No, Robert said finally. No children listed for Thomas and Eleanor Ashford. Gregory's family records are quite clear on that. Thomas died in 1988, and he had no children from his marriage to Eleanor. But Margaret's birth certificate listed father as unknown. The possibility emerged like something taking physical form. Eleanor was pregnant when she married Thomas. Pregnant with Patricia. Patricia, who was Margaret's mother. Which meant Thomas Ashford had married a woman carrying another man's child. Which meant somewhere in this story was a man powerful enough that Eleanor wouldn't name him. Powerful enough that she'd fled Vienna, arrived in America pregnant and alone, been hired by his younger brother, married that brother to give her daughter legitimacy. Margaret found old letters from Eleanor to Patricia, written in German, tucked into Patricia's old desk. She had them professionally translated by someone at the local university, a linguistics professor who recognized the urgency in Margaret's voice. The translated letters revealed a woman in pain, in hiding, in constant fear. One letter read, "The truth would destroy him. Better to let it die with me." Another, "Your father is a good man. I couldn't burden him with this." Phrases suggesting Eleanor had been fleeing, seeking safety, protecting someone through her silence. Who was so powerful, so important, that Eleanor would sacrifice her own truth to protect him. Robert's genealogical reconstruction of the Ashford family provided the final puzzle pieces. Thomas Ashford had been engaged to someone else in 1952, a woman from a prominent Portland family named Margaret Whitmore. The engagement had been broken off abruptly in February 1952, exactly 1 month before Eleanor's employment with the Ashford family ended. Thomas had then married Eleanor in April 1953. The timeline crystallized. Eleanor became pregnant in late 1952, probably. She told whoever fathered the child, someone whose identity mattered enough that it had to be protected. She fled to Vienna, where Thomas employed her. She married Thomas to give the child legitimacy. She came to America and became invisible. Someone had orchestrated all of this. Someone with enough power that Eleanor's silence was the price of her survival and her daughter's future. Then Gregory appeared at Margaret's apartment building on a Thursday evening, disheveled and desperate in a way his expensive suit couldn't hide. "I've been investigating you," he said, without preamble, standing in her doorway. "I know about your daughter. I know about the medical bills. I know about everything." Margaret's stomach tightened with anger and fear. "How did you?" "The investigator I hired," Gregory interrupted. "He was thorough. Too thorough, I think. Because I've learned things I didn't expect to learn." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His face was haggard, his silver hair slightly disheveled. "My brother Thomas died in 1988, Gregory said. "I never understood why he married Eleanor so suddenly. It seemed impulsive for him, out of character. But when I went through his papers after he died, I found old letters. She was pregnant, Margaret. Eleanor was already pregnant when they married." "I know," Margaret said quietly. Gregory's eyes widened. "You know, my genealogist found it. Thomas married my grandmother because she was carrying another man's child. My mother." The words hung between them. Gregory sat down heavily on Margaret's couch, as if the truth had physically drained him. "She was pregnant with Patricia," he said slowly, working through it. "Which means Patricia had another father. Which means you have family history we don't know," Margaret finished. "Medical history we can't access. A genetic lineage that's completely blank on Sarah's medical forms." Gregory looked at her with something approaching desperation. "We need to find out who he was, whoever her biological father was. He's the key to understanding Eleanor's entire story. Our quest for truth is now inextricably linked," Margaret said, echoing his own words back to him. Gregory nodded slowly. "I have resources, private investigators, access to family archives, people who can find information that public records won't reveal. And I have, Margaret said, documentation, photographs, connections. Moral clarity about what Eleanor sacrificed and why. They stood facing each other across the small living room, the waitress and the wealthy man, the desperate mother and the confused heir, united by a secret that had been buried for 70 years and was now demanding to be exposed. Neither of them knew yet that the conspiracy ran deeper than either could imagine. Neither of them knew that the man Eleanor had protected was still alive, still powerful, still actively working to keep the past buried. But they were about to find out. Gregory's private investigator, a woman named Victoria Chun with connections that ran deep through Portland's institutional networks, had uncovered layers of history that rewrote everything they thought they understood. Margaret Whitmore had been Thomas Ashford's fiancée in 1952. Not a casual relationship, a strategic alliance between two of Portland's most prominent families, the kind of merger conducted through engagement announcements and carefully planned social appearances. Margaret came from old money, the kind that had accumulated over generations and calcified into social structure. She was beautiful in the way wealthy people often are, polished, confident, accustomed to having her preferences respected without question. And then Thomas had broken the engagement. The Whitmore family had interpreted this as personal rejection. They never knew Eleanor was already pregnant. They never knew Thomas had chosen honor over business, that he'd watched a young woman fleeing an impossible situation and decided his inheritance wasn't worth her vulnerability. They saw only that he'd abandoned Margaret for someone beneath their social station. The revenge had been methodical and thorough. Gregory's father had issued an ultimatum. Choose the Whitmore business alliance or choose Eleanor. Thomas had chosen Eleanor. The Ashford family had cut him off financially, severing him from the wealth that had been his birthright. Eleanor had spent her marriage knowing she'd cost Thomas everything: his family inheritance, his social position, his future security. She'd carried that knowledge like the locket around her neck, a constant reminder of the price of love. Eleanor had died in 1989 without ever revealing the truth about Margaret's biological father. She'd taken that secret to her grave, protecting someone powerful enough to demand her silence. But the Whitmore family had spent 70 years ensuring the Ashford family's business interests were systematically blocked. Deals that should have gone through were mysteriously derailed. Contracts were lost to competitors. Investment opportunities evaporated. The wound of rejection, misinterpreted as personal insult rather than family sacrifice, had festered into institutional sabotage. The Ashford family had declined from prominence not because they lacked capability, because someone with significant influence had spent decades making sure they couldn't succeed. Margaret Whitmore Sterling was now 78 years old. She'd married someone else, a man named Richard Sterling, who died 15 years ago, and she'd become powerful in her own right. She sat on the boards of 3 major corporations. She held significant influence in Portland's business, healthcare, and philanthropic circles. And she sat on the hospital board where Sarah was being treated. This was the realization that had turned Margaret's blood cold when Gregory discovered it. Sarah's treatment options had been systematically limited not by circumstance, but by deliberate administrative action. Margaret Whitmore Sterling had championed specific budget cuts that affected the pediatric oncology department. Research funding had been redirected. Experimental treatment protocols had been defunded. A specialist who could have helped Sarah, Dr. Michael Torres, one of the most promising young oncologists in the Pacific Northwest, had been suddenly transferred to a facility in Seattle. The historical injustice now had present-day stakes. A child's life hung in the balance, suspended between the past Margaret Whitmore Sterling couldn't let go of and the future Sarah Chun deserved. When Margaret Whitmore Sterling discovered that Gregory was investigating, her response was swift and decisive. She used her influence to pressure the hospital board. Sarah's medical team faced sudden administrative scrutiny. Insurance decisions that had previously been straightforward became complicated. Treatment options that had been available were suddenly classified as experimental and therefore ineligible for coverage. She wasn't just covering up the past anymore. She was actively harming the present. Margaret and Gregory understood this only when James, the social worker, called Margaret with barely concealed anger in his voice. "Something changed with your daughter's case," he said. "I've been working in this system for 12 years, And I've never seen a treatment denial move this fast. It's like someone at the administrative level specifically requested that certain protocols be restricted. Who? Margaret whispered. I don't know yet, James said, but I'm going to find out. Because this isn't how medicine works. This is personal. It took Victoria Chun 3 days to trace the directive to Margaret Whitmore Sterling's personal request, documented in an email to the hospital's chief financial officer. The Ashford family doesn't deserve premium resources in our system. The personal vendetta had metastasized into institutional abuse. Margaret and Gregory sat in Gregory's penthouse office, looking at printouts of those emails, understanding with complete clarity what they were facing. They weren't fighting against a system. They were fighting against a woman who had wielded power like a weapon for 70 years, who had confused personal hurt with moral authority, who had sacrificed a child's health on the altar of her own wounded pride. We have to expose this, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the rage moving through her. We have to make her answer for what she's done. Gregory nodded slowly. The Portland Healthcare Foundation annual gala is in 2 weeks. Margaret Whitmore Sterling is the honored guest. There will be media, donors, prominent citizens. If we're going to do this, that's where it happens. In front of everyone, Margaret said. In front of everyone, Gregory confirmed. Because what she did, what she's been doing, this isn't just about business or personal grudges anymore. This is about a child's life. This is about systemic abuse of power. They looked at each other across the desk, understanding that they were about to burn down a 70-year-old lie, understanding that there would be consequences, that Margaret Whitmore Sterling wouldn't go quietly, that the institutional forces aligned with her would fight back. But Sarah needed treatment. Sarah needed a future. And sometimes justice required that you walk directly into the fire and demand accountability, regardless of how powerful the person holding the match. Outside Gregory's office, Portland stretched beneath them, unaware that in 2 weeks, everything would change. A secret would be exposed. A vendetta would be revealed. A child would be given the chance to live. And Margaret Whitmore Sterling would finally have to answer for 70 years of damage. The grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel gleamed with a particular brightness that only wealth could purchase. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across 200 prominent citizens. CEOs, philanthropists, board members, media figures. They'd arrived in designer clothes and expensive cars, prepared to celebrate another year of Margaret Whitmore Sterling's generosity and influence. Margaret Whitmore Sterling stood near the entrance, accepting congratulations with practiced grace. She wore a diamond necklace that probably cost more than Margaret earned in a year. Her smile was controlled, satisfied, the smile of someone who had never lost a strategic battle. In the corner, hidden behind servers and caterers, Sarah sat in a wheelchair, her small frame fragile in a dress her mother had specially chosen. Sarah wasn't supposed to be here. Her medical team had said she was too weak, that the environment would be too stimulating, that the risk was too great. But Margaret had made a decision. Sarah needed to see what justice looked like. Gregory had orchestrated everything with meticulous precision. The large projection screens had been coordinated with the gala's technical team under the guise of displaying sponsor information. The microphone had been arranged. The media had been invited with subtle tips about a story breaking at the event. When Gregory took the microphone during the awards ceremony, the room quieted with the particular attention that wealth commands. I'm here tonight to tell you a story about my brother, Gregory began, his voice carrying across the ballroom. His tone was calm, measured, the voice of a man stating facts rather than accusations. The first image appeared on the massive screens, 2 lockets photographed side by side. Identical. The audience leaned forward, confused. 2 identical pieces, Gregory continued, made as a pair in 1952 in Vienna by a master craftsman named Heinrich Reiss. Only 2 were ever made. He paused, letting the image settle. My brother Thomas loved Eleanor Hoffman. Another image, the photograph of Eleanor and Thomas in Vienna. Eleanor's smile genuine and unguarded. He chose her over a business alliance. He chose love over business. Margaret stepped forward, wheeling Sarah to the edge of the visible space. The audience stirred, sensing a shift in the narrative's emotional register. Eleanor was my grandmother, Margaret said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. She carried this locket her entire life. She held up the silver piece, letting the light catch it. She was pregnant when she married Thomas Ashford. The genealogical charts filled the screens, family trees, birth records, immigration documents, all displayed in meticulous detail. The genealogist's video played, his voice clinical but clear. Eleanor Hoffman arrived in Portland in 1953, pregnant and alone. She married Thomas Ashford 4 months after arriving in America, giving legitimacy to her daughter. Gregory's voice continued over the images. The Ashford family rejected my brother for choosing Eleanor. My father demanded he choose business or love. Thomas chose love, and our family cut him off financially, severing him from everything he was supposed to inherit. Margaret. And 70 years later, that rejection still affects us. It still affects my daughter. Then Gregory shifted tone, his voice becoming harder. There's more, he said, because this story doesn't exist in isolation. It exists in the present. It affects the decisions being made right now in this city, in the institutions we've entrusted with our health and our futures. He gestured, and hospital budget documents filled the screens. Treatment protocols, research funding, specialist assignments. Margaret Whitmore Sterling sat on this foundation's board, Gregory said, his eyes finding her in the crowd. And she used her influence to limit treatment options for pediatric cancer patients. She championed budget cuts that specifically restricted experimental treatments. She had specialists transferred away from a department. The audience was silent now, understanding the implication before it was explicitly stated. Well, my niece, Gregory gestured toward Sarah, needed cutting-edge treatment. Those cuts meant she couldn't access it. A 7-year-old girl with leukemia, denied access to experimental treatments that could save her life because of budget decisions made by someone settling a 70-year-old personal vendetta. Margaret Whitmore Sterling stood to leave, her posture dignified, her expression dismissive. But the doors had been quietly closed by security. She was trapped. Sarah's small voice came through the microphone, wheeled closer by a hospital staff member. I don't know what happened in 1952, Sarah said, her words careful, her voice thin but clear. I just know I'm sick, and I want to live. The silence was absolute. Margaret's voice trembled. Margaret Whitmore Sterling didn't just reject my family 70 years ago. Her decisions might cost my daughter her life. Gregory, his voice breaking. This isn't about revenge. This is about acknowledging the damage, about stopping it, because the past isn't past. It's affecting a 7-year-old girl's life right now. Margaret Whitmore Sterling was forced to address the crowd. She attempted denial, claiming the budget cuts were necessary financial decisions made on merit. But a hospital administrator stepped forward with documentation in hand. These decisions were made specifically to limit experimental treatments that could have helped pediatric patients, she said. And I have emails from Ms. Whitmore Sterling specifically requesting these restrictions. The administrator's voice echoed through the ballroom as she read Margaret Whitmore Sterling's own words from the screens. The Ashford family doesn't deserve premium resources in our system. The audience gasped. The personal vendetta was exposed. The business decision was revealed as personal punishment. The institutional abuse was documented and undeniable. Margaret Whitmore Sterling attempted to leave. Security gently prevented it. She stood frozen, trapped by her own documented words and actions, trapped by the 7-year-old girl in the wheelchair, trapped by a secret that had demanded to be spoken after 70 years of silence. The fallout was immediate. Media phones erupted with live updates. Social media exploded with the story. Within an hour, it was trending nationally. Wealthy philanthropists' decade-long vendetta against child cancer treatment. Former allies distanced themselves. Sponsorships were withdrawn from organizations bearing her name. The foundation's board called for her resignation within 12 hours. Hospital administrators announced an immediate review of all budget decisions made under her influence. Systems were reformed. Transparency requirements were implemented. No single board member could unilaterally cut pediatric treatment funding ever again. One person's truth had exposed systemic corruption. One person's courage had changed institutional structures. And a 7-year-old girl with leukemia had learned that her story mattered, that her life mattered, that sometimes justice requires standing in front of powerful people and refusing to be invisible. If you're watching this right now, if you feel the weight of what Margaret and Sarah just endured, if you understand what it means to fight against systems designed to protect the powerful, you need to subscribe. Because there are more stories like this, more families fighting against institutional abuse, more truths demanding to be spoken. Subscribe, because the next story could be yours. 6 weeks later, the Portland morning moved with the particular quality of spring beginning. Rain and light mixing into something that felt like possibility. Sarah sat in the treatment room at Portland General, connected to a 4-line delivering the experimental chemotherapy protocol that had previously been denied to her. Dr. Michael Torres, the specialist who'd been transferred to Seattle, had been brought back to Portland specifically to oversee her case. Her first month of treatment showed promising results. The leukemia markers were declining. The possibility of remission had shifted from theoretical hope to tangible reality. The hospital foundation had reversed the budget cuts within 48 hours of the gala confrontation. Sarah gained access not just to experimental treatments, but to the most advanced protocols available. Medical bills from the past had been forgiven through a newly established fund, the Eleanor and Thomas Ashford Foundation for Healthcare Justice, established with Gregory's personal contribution of $5 million. Margaret received a promotion at Rosewood Diner, her wages increasing substantially. The diner's owner, moved by her story, offered her an ownership stake in exchange for her years of dedication. Margaret's second job became unnecessary. For the first time in years, she slept more than 5 hours a night. For the first time, the debt didn't feel like an ocean she was drowning in. The hospital had established an ethics oversight committee with representation from diverse stakeholders: patients, community members, medical staff. No single board member could unilaterally make decisions affecting treatment protocols. Monthly reports on budget allocation were now published publicly. Healthcare decisions could no longer be made based on personal grudges buried in the past. Systems had shifted. Structures had been reformed. One truth had changed everything. Gregory visited Sarah regularly, bringing books and sitting beside her during treatments. She called him Uncle Gregory now, though no blood relation existed. Only something deeper, a family forged through courage and shared purpose. He told her stories about Thomas, about Eleanor, about the locket, and what it had meant. Margaret and Gregory had forged a friendship that transcended the investigation that had created it. They met for coffee weekly. They spoke on the phone several times a week. The partnership that had begun in desperation had transformed into something purposeful. Patricia, Margaret's mother, finally learned the full truth about Eleanor. Not fragments or scattered stories, but the complete narrative. Eleanor's escape, her sacrifice, her silent protection of someone powerful enough to demand her silence. Patricia wept when she understood what her mother had given up, not just her own truth, but the possibility of Patricia knowing her own biological heritage. But Eleanor's memory was transformed through that truth. No longer a mystery or a shame. It became a story of extraordinary courage. Eleanor's sacrifice was honored, not pitted. The family's history transformed from something hidden and fragmentary into something dignified and complete. Gregory used his family's reclaimed reputation to help other communities. He established the Eleanor and Thomas Ashford Foundation for Healthcare Justice, specifically supporting patients whose treatment had been denied due to systemic bias. He appeared at community events, telling Eleanor's story, talking about how love had mattered more to Thomas than business, how justice had required that they expose what institutional power tried to hide. My brother spent his life trying to prove that love mattered more than business, Gregory said at a speaking engagement 6 months after the gala. He was right. Eleanor proved it. Margaret proved it. And a 7-year-old girl proved it. Margaret wrote Eleanor's story, a memoir combining family history with broader social commentary on systemic healthcare inequities. The book was published, drawing national attention to how institutional decisions made for personal reasons rippled outward to harm the most vulnerable. She became an advocate for patients' rights, her voice carrying the particular credibility that comes from lived experience. Sarah asked her one afternoon, as the early effects of treatment began strengthening her. "Mom, why did you keep fighting when everything seemed impossible?" Margaret held her daughter's hand. "Because Eleanor fought. Because your life matters. Because the truth matters. And because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to accept injustice, even when you're terrified." The two lockets were placed in the hospital's history museum behind glass, with a placard reading, "These lockets represent a family separated by history, but reunited by truth." Eleanor Hoffman Ashford, 1925 to 1989. Her courage to love beyond boundaries changed generations. Sarah planted a garden in Eleanor's memory in the hospital courtyard. Flowers from Vienna mixed with Portland wildflowers, a living symbol of the bridge between worlds. Every patient in the pediatric ward could see the garden from their window. It became a symbol of hope and the power of refusing to accept unjust circumstances. 6 months into treatment, Sarah's leukemia entered remission. Her first day back at school became a milestone celebration, not just for her, but for everyone who had fought for her survival. She told her teachers, "My great-grandmother was brave. Now I'm brave too." She wrote a school essay about Eleanor, Gregory, and her mother's courage. The essay won a local writing competition. She donated the prize money to the Eleanor and Thomas Ashford Foundation. Sarah discovered what her mother had learned. Your story has power. Your voice matters. Margaret and Gregory continued investigating other historical injustices. They discovered 3 more families affected by similar patterns of prejudice and institutional harm. They established a program called Untold Stories, dedicated to investigating and publicizing family histories that illuminate systemic injustice. Their work received recognition from civil rights organizations. They appeared together at speaking engagements, telling Eleanor's story, helping others understand that buried secrets often carry present-day consequences. 1 year after the gala confrontation, Margaret stood in Eleanor's garden on the anniversary of Sarah's remission diagnosis. Sarah stood beside her, healthy enough now to walk, though she moved with the particular care of someone whose body still remembered trauma. "Eleanor spent her life keeping secrets to protect people she loved," Margaret said softly. "But sometimes protecting people means telling the truth, no matter how much it costs." "And the truth helped me live," Sarah said, her small hand gripping her mother's. Gregory joined them, placing his hand on the garden's Vienna roses. Eleanor's locket carried a secret for 70 years. But secrets are only powerful when they're hidden. Once they're exposed, they lose their power to hurt us. The Portland skyline stretched behind them, the city that had harbored both secrets and truth, both injustice and the possibility of redemption. If you're watching this story unfold, you understand what Margaret fought for, what Sarah survived, what Eleanor sacrificed. You might have your own buried history. You might have family secrets demanding to be spoken. The world needs your truth. Like this video if Eleanor's story moved you. Subscribe for more untold stories of hidden connections and explosive truths that change everything. Share this with someone who needs to know. Their story matters. Their family history matters. Justice might be delayed, but it's never impossible. Comment below. What family truth have you been afraid to speak? Sometimes speaking it is the first step toward healing, because the truth has power, and you deserve to use it.